Hi there. I'd like to tell you some stories about Croatia in 1993, more particularly where the European Community Monitor Mission was involved in areas that have been secured by the Serbs who had attacked various Croat communities and driven them out. Prior to the war, the Serbs were about 16% of the population of Croatia. During the war, they seized about 30% of the territory, and at the end of the war, they were driven from almost all of it. And now, today, they're about 4 or 5% of the population of Croatia. At the time, we couldn't be sure that this would be the outcome. All that we knew as monitors was that we were sent to report on what we were seeing, and one of the craziest places that I was ever sent to in my life was the town of Knin, K-N-I-N, and it was the so-called capital of the autonomous Serb areas within Croatia. Here's a map to show you what it looked like. The red is the area of currently the sovereign territory of Croatia, and the blue was areas taken over and controlled militarily by the Serbs for the period of the war, and from which they were ejected and retreated at the end of the war, so that the entire place is Croatia. If you look at the very southern part of the biggest blue zone, you'll see the town of Knin mentioned there. How did I get to Knin? I was assigned to geographic monitoring as just another monitor when I arrived in the mission, but I was spotted by one of the guys who ran one of the 4 regions, and he wanted me to go as his deputy. And so within a few weeks, I went from being a monitor to being a deputy head of a regional center. This officer was then replaced almost immediately, and a new officer came to replace him, who was not a military officer. Most of the monitors were military officers. This new head of the region was a diplomat. He had just been an ambassador in a small but very important country. And more importantly for him, having been married recently, he had just had his first child. So he was absent for 3/4 of his period that he was appointed to run the area. And as his deputy, I had to step up and do various functions for the area. So I'm going to tell you about 2 events that happened to me personally whilst I was there. The first event was very sad. We had a humanitarian team. The European community had a very large support to humanitarian effort. Lots of countries wanted to give aid to the people of former Yugoslavia to help them. And so we had a visit from our headquarters in Zagreb of people who were showing around representatives from the actual community in Brussels to talk about where aid was needed, what humanitarian support needed to be given. And it was a very important group that were coming to visit in Knin. So I had to get myself ready. Now, the uniforms we wore as the European Community Monitor Mission were all white. Long white pants, white sleeve shirt, white jacket, and white shoes. Quite a challenge. But luckily, from my naval time, I had beautiful white doeskin, which is the finest suede you can find, shoes for very special formal occasions. And this was the only time I took those shoes out with my regular white pants and my shirt, and it was pretty cold then, so we had white jackets as well. But I had my lovely white doeskin shoes on. And we went to a meeting in the government liaison office, which was just a local government office that had been taken over by this new self-proclaimed government in Knin. And the VIPs sat around and they talked with a guy who'd been a small town lawyer in former Yugoslavia, but who was now the official liaison with the international community for the government in Knin. It was a meandering, impossible meeting. Far from coming armed with a list of, like a shopping list, and presenting these rich Europeans with something that they wanted to do, they wanted to help, because it was purely humanitarian, we got the long, rambling, starting back in the 13th century, this is the problem, this is why, and it was all just very difficult. In the middle of the presentation or the discussion, there was a rattle of automatic fire from out in the street. This was absolutely normal. Knin was like Dodge City in the cowboy movies, just different kinds of cowboys and automatic weapons, not pistols. That was the only difference. I didn't think anything of it. The humanitarian VIPs were extremely worried about a rattle of automatic fire in the street. And so I had to say, look, it's quite routine here. Don't worry about a thing. I'll go out and check that we're safe when it's time to go. I've got a radio. I'll call the cars. Everybody, stay calm. And now I want to jump forward. I jump forward now to 15, 16 years after the war has ended in the former Yugoslavia. And I'm attending a NATO training session at one of their establishments where I'm going to role play a senior, white hair, white beard, civilian head of mission for the UN somewhere, and the NATO military have to learn how to interact with cantankerous, difficult senior civilians that they can't order around. So we're about 4 days into this learning the role play, learning what we're doing, and a very distinguished guy came up to me and he said, "Is your name Graham?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Was you ever in Knin?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you remember a meeting with the humanitarian representatives of the European Commission, and there was all sorts of gunfire in the street outside the building?" And I suddenly came back to this. I had forgotten all about this meeting. I said, yes, I remember it. And he said, "I was there. I was the military guy that was taking the VIPs round. They were really worried about it. We were shocked when you said, 'Oh, don't worry, this happens a lot of the time, shooting in the street, blah, 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 blah.'" And now I want to take you back to the shooting in the street. I went downstairs to check that everything was okay. I was not in the slightest concerned. But what had happened, very unfortunately, 2 soldiers, brothers, on leave from the front line, drunk, shot at each other in the street over a girl, missed each other, but hit and seriously wounded 2 women who were helped into the foyer of the building we were having the meeting in. And sadly, tragically, these 2 poor ladies who were just about their business, trying to find something to buy for food, they both died before they could be got to hospital. And the white marble floor of the foyer had rivulets of blood trickling across it. It was a scene from a Tarantino movie or something. And so, with my beautiful white suede shoes, I tiptoed over the rivulets of blood. I looked out in the street. Everything had gone. The soldiers were gone. There was nothing. So I came back up and I told them, and I'd called the cars on our little handy-talkie, and the cars came and picked us up and took us away. I had forgotten all about that until this guy approached me at this NATO training thing. And I think what happens there is, of course, when anything is shocking and you don't like it, you put it in a cardboard box and you take it up into the attic of your mind and you put it at the back of the attic and you don't think about it again. But it was typical Knin. Another time, I was sitting talking to one of the liaison officers, not the lawyer, who was, frankly, a very strange person. I was talking to this liaison officer who was very, very normal and very decent, and we had some great conversations. We never solved a single issue because basically they didn't want to solve issues. They wanted just for everybody to go home and leave them in charge of huge chunks of land that they had stolen. And then the 2 of us looked at each other and there was a strange rumbling coming from the street. And he went to the window and he looked out and he said, "Come and look at this." And I went to the window, and there in the street, rumbling along, were 3 T-34 tanks. Now this slide shows you a stock footage of a T-34 tank. But these were old Soviet-era tanks that had been built in the former Yugoslavia under license, and they were there really is more as mobile artillery on the front line. And what was amazing, the tanks rumbled up the street. They were maybe 50 to 100 meters apart. And every now and again they would stop and they would use their tracks to turn, and they would stick their barrel into the window of a shop and waggle the barrel using the turret, smashing up the shop window, back out, turn, and come up the High Street Mall. And I turned to, his name was Mladen. I said, Mladen, what are they doing? And Mladen just shrugged his shoulders and he said, these are ordinary soldiers from the front line. They're putting their lives on the line every day. And all they hear about when they come home for their short little leave of 24 hours is how certain guys are making money out of their families. They're selling this, they're selling that. And they've mutinied. They've left the front line with their tanks, and about 120 of them have come into town. Oh, and you see that guy there? And there was some terrible figure, all black and even tied up. They said, that's their colonel. They've basically tied him up, covered him with oil from the engines of their tanks, and they've said they're going to leave him on the steps of the war ministry. I mean, I can't tell you how flabbergasted I was. He's completely honestly and openly describing what has happened. There's been a mutiny on the front line. A couple of battalions of soldiers, because they had very small numbers in their battalions, plus 3 tanks, have come into town. They've smashed up the shop fronts of war profiteers who they hate. They've put their colonel in dreadful state on the front steps of what is called the War Ministry. It's just another office. And then they retreated for 36 hours, got horribly drunk, and after 48 hours they were back on the front line again. But they had mutinied because of the conditions they were in. And I think it's very easy to think of sometimes these people as being monolithic bad or monolithic evil. Fact is, most combatants are ordinary people carried along by a tide of events in their life, and they find themselves on a front line, and if their people are legitimate, they will work for them, and if they're not legitimate, they will mutiny. Some of you may have heard about possible mutinies in the Russian army in Ukraine. I've seen it, just in a different place and 25 years earlier. It's exactly what happens. I offer these thoughts as a way of saying not everything is as it seems, especially in places like Knin. Thank you.